the challenge, the opportunity to connect. The 1960s, a time of imagination and change, a time of anger and fear. The 1960s, a program called Challenge.
Good evening, ladies and gentlemen.
Looked at our connections, our divisions, through the lens of faith. Nearly 60 years later, during these challenging times, we'll take a new look at our divisions, our connections, in a new program called Challenge 2.0. The untouched birthday cake was the first sign of trouble. One member of a Thai soccer team, a boy nicknamed Knight, had just turned 17, but failed to appear at a planned family celebration. The reason for his absence on June 23rd of last year was discovered in hours, but it brought little, if any, reassurance. Knight's bicycle and those of his 11 teammates and his coach would be discovered near the entrance to a deep cave called Tham Luang in northern Thailand. Exploring the cave was a frequent rite of passage. It became rapidly apparent that all had gone inside and were now trapped by rising water. How far they were inside was not known. But what was known is the cave complex extended for miles underground, that the monsoon would soon bring increasing rain, flooding the caves for months. But against all odds, after 14 days, 2 weeks of entrapment, rescuers led all 13 to safety. The backstory of what permitted them to endure the experience is the subject of this episode of Challenge 2.0. Emergence, Lessons of Faith, Lessons of Spirit. We have two panelists who are very well qualified to understand all the different nuances, the issues behind this story. Kanjan Cederman, thank you for joining us, head minister of Seattle Enkyoji Buddhist Temple, having become a monk, I believe, at the age of 18, and that was followed by time studying in Japan. And we should mention that Buddhism both was and is the faith of, from my understanding, 11 of the 12 members of that soccer team. And the team coach had been a Buddhist monk for some 12 years, so we're looking for some perspective there. Dr. Richard Berger, thank you for joining us. Professor Emeritus at the University of Washington School of Medicine and a mindfulness instructor at the university's Center for Child and Family Well-Being. Thank you for joining us, and I know you've got some interesting perspectives as well, because this really involves a unique blend, I think, of cultural, spiritual, emotional, and physiological issues for these boys. And I think we might be well off just to set the stage before we even get into the various issues, understanding the setting these boys were in. They were in a very small cave, narrow shelf. They had maybe a candy bar or two. Their water was limited to what was condensing and running down the walls of the cave. It was cold, the waters were rising, and it was pitch black because their flashlights had run out of batteries. What physical and emotional challenges were these boys? We can imagine what our reaction might be, but what were they likely facing at that time?
I've tried to imagine what they were going through. I would have been extremely scared. I mean, to say the least. My heart would have been racing once I figured out we're trapped. I would have been breathing heavily. I would be disoriented and having a full flight or fight reaction, but I couldn't do either.
Right.
I couldn't get away.
No place to go.
No place to go. I'm stuck. So there I am. There were others with me. That's the one good thing. I can't imagine being alone in a place like that. And I had a mentor. So there were positive things, but my mind wouldn't have gone there, most likely. And it would have taken something to really get me out of that fear reaction before I could have began to cope with what was going on.
Kanjan, any perspectives on that from you?
It's interesting as the physiological reaction, of course, people can, of course, relate to it on different levels. In some of my practice, actually, I had experienced a lot of physiological reactions based on environment, which is what you could imagine. It's really amazing what happens, especially when you understand that this is life and death. Also, the idea of coldness, also not having food, also not knowing anything. It's really interesting because we can really understand and see who we really are at that point. And sometimes during training, we simulate this. But of course, usually with training, you have the idea that there's an end.
Yeah.
But in that situation, I could just imagine, and as he was saying, that actually that is the most human reaction, is of course fear in those situations.
Now, the coach of the soccer team had been a Buddhist monk for 12 years. How would that background, the set of skills, the set of knowledge, the, if you will, foundation that provided the coach, how might that have worked to aid those boys? Kanjan, I might start with you.
I think that, first of all, being a coach, he had a responsibility for others to
Right.
lead them. I think that was a positive. And then having been a Buddhist monk, in Buddhism, we're constantly dealing with this idea of life and death. And in that constant dealing of life and death, we understand the severity of our practice. So I think in that moment, in order to be a good leader, to be to be helpful to the other children, he must have realized through his practice, remove the concept of the fear of death. And of course, that's both physiological and mental fear that basically incapacitates ourselves. And it could have been because of his practice that he was able to be aware of the possibilities, as you were saying, perhaps see the potential, but also see what needs to be done at that moment rather than being led simply by thoughts of doom and death and destruction. I think that probably aided him. And then also him knowing techniques, both for himself and for others. And the last part is, of course, being able to deal with others, because being able to have those abilities yourself is different than being able to impart them to others. And also to make sure that everyone remains calm and also doesn't become overexcited or kind of have a freak out, as people say, which is very easy in that situation because, as you said, dark, wet, cold, all of the things that basically when the senses are confused, our initial reaction is emotion. And we know emotion usually tends towards the negative, especially in somewhat bleak situations.
When you were talking of techniques, we know from hindsight, from the boys coming out, the coach
Right.
coming out, that one of the things they did on a regular basis was meditation, mindfulness
that's
meditation. Rick, could you give us a little background as to what exactly that is and how the coach likely used it to aid the boys? We might begin with you on that.
Instead of the fear reaction overtaking someone and leading them, they would step back a bit from it and say, I'm having a fear reaction. Part of mindfulness, I think, is being able to look at the gamut of what's available to you and what's actually there. Say, to notice the water dripping down the thing, and maybe we can drink that. Or, what skills do I have? I've been a monk, right? I know how to meditate, and maybe I can help these kids calm them down and get them also step back from their rather dire situation. And maybe even pay attention, you're still alive. Not push the real danger away, but to put it in perspective and to not ignore everything else.
Kenjin, any further thoughts?
Absolutely. In more of a Buddhist concept, they use the idea of the mind being a mirror. So being able to reflect clearly and realistically as the idea as it is. That is done through training. It's not just something that people can automatically pull out. Because most of the time, the mind takes over or the body takes over. But as he was saying, this awareness of as it is, and then within that mirror, being able to reflect the situation and see what needs to be done at that moment, rather than making up a story or making up a scenario of we're doomed, and that's all that people can do. And actually, as we know, that's enough to incapacitate you to not be able to do anything, to look at anything positive, such as you might see that with anger, because people react differently. Maybe not everyone reacted with fear. Maybe people reacted with anger. And we can see that actually, like a mirror, we're able to see that actually, is this the proper reaction? Is this actually, because it's not removing it, but being able to clearly show what it is, and then to see if it's applicable to the situation. So it's not removing emotion, which people think when you meditate, well, I'll be emotionless, or I won't think. Not at all. What it is putting it into proper perspective, and we use the catchphrase, as it is.
It might be a good time now just to pause. We know that these boys had ample time to practice meditation. It wasn't until 9 days later that divers from the UK, from Great Britain, actually discovered them. And we have some photographs, as a matter of fact, we're going to go to now. July 2nd, 2 divers from Great Britain discovered the boys, and you can tell how literally they were blinded by the torches. They had been in nothing but darkness for those 9 days. It strikes me as being incredible that these boys, and they came from a very rural area of Thailand, the border between Thailand and its neighbors, they weren't actually citizens of any country. They were later made citizens of Thailand, that they managed to persevere. And I think what I might ask on behalf of people that are curious about this is, how does the practice of mindfulness meditation change us not only emotionally, but what physiological changes occur as a result of that? Rick, we might begin with you on that.
The changes that I'm familiar with occur in the brain, and it's based on something called neuroplasticity. And what that means is, when we practice something, we get better at it. Okay, and we get better at it by developing new neurons and new connections. So if we practice something long enough, we'll have, instead of a little country road going from one area to the other, we'll have a 6-lane highway. Okay, so if we have our natural reaction is to go down the way of least resistance, which is hard to begin with. But with time, you develop, instead of going to the worst scenario, maybe you go to the best scenario, okay, and act on that. There are a number of areas. The amygdala, which controls, especially the right one, I think it is, mostly anger, and fear, gets smaller, okay? The left prefrontal cortex, which has decision-making activity, gets bigger, from continually bringing yourself back to the breath or some other bodily sensation. There are areas, the sensory areas of your body and your inner body get bigger, and the areas that control emotion get stronger. And this can be at least after 8 weeks. And you can measure sometimes differences after 8 to 10 minutes of, say, things like startle response. Something could have actually happened with these boys in that short period of time.
Kenjan, I would ask you for your perceptions on that, and also the larger setting that mindfulness meditation, as possibly practiced in the cave or in any setting, might have rested in terms of allowing the boys not to develop a controversial or a difficulty in terms of relating to each other, but being able to cooperate with each other and meld into a team that seemed, as we know now, to persist well after they were evacuated from the cave.
First of all, the perspective of Buddhism in modern time, because Buddhism has been really related as a religion, actually I would disagree with that, in my opinion, that actually the practice is for medicine. So actually we're healing ourselves, we're learning to heal ourselves. Master Tiantai of the ancient China, he said, why do people look for expensive medicines and wait for doctors to make it and look for hard to find herbs when we have this medicine which is free and that we can practice on our own. And actually we can see the healing effects of it. And one of the points that you had made, I believe, is the concept of dualism. The concept of dualism, this idea of good and bad, or even if we look at something, not necessarily just thinking of positive thinking, because a lot of the modern time would just think positively.
Yeah.
But when you're in a situation like that, sometimes very difficult. And also that is not always the best thing, because the reality is very important as well. So removing the idea of dualistic thinking comes from this awareness, and then dealing with what needs to happen. Because if you have a bunch of different people, even the idea of self and other, as you were talking about their interpersonal relationships, if I think of you suddenly different than myself, and in that situation, that would have been very detrimental, as you said, the Lord of the Flies, I think you agree.
Yes.
That could have very easily become that. But why didn't it become that? When those kinds of situations, even not as severe as those, people tend to lose their relationship with other people. And then also they tend to immediately think of self. But actually through the practice of awareness, cessation and contemplation, because contemplation is not just stopping the mind, but awakening something within ourselves. We use the idea of Buddha nature. That's our original nature. And through that original nature is actually able to see reality as it is. So I think that with the relationship and also the situation, because if you imagine pure darkness, some people might think, oh, I could handle that, but not for 8 days, you said, directly, and also coldness as well. That actually, if one doesn't have this state that they're able to awaken, or even through the posture of sitting, and as you said, observing the breath, it is a technique. It is a practice. Without that, very easy that the reactionary, the typical we call the monkey mind or the animalistic mind comes out, and then suddenly you have chaos. So that's why I think this is a really good life example of how the process actually works. And as you were saying with the mind, how you were able to have the ability to think differently. Even physiologically, you can change your heart rate, your blood pressure. As we know, it also allows your blood pressure to go up when you're scared. But how about really making your blood pressure lower? Or also your reflex sweating, and also, as you said, awareness, and also the idea of being compassionate. All of that, all of those good positive traits don't have a place within the mind of selfishness or animalistic mind, because simply it has a survival reactionary behavioral effect. So that's why I think that actually this is a very good example, because the result is the actual showing that it works.
The conclusion to their story brings up some interesting points as well. It was not, after they were discovered, and we talked about that, it was not just a simple matter of leading them out of the cave. Numerous passages were flooded. Some of the segments were as narrow as about 15 to 16 inches. You think of an adult diver getting through that with scuba. None of the boys could scuba dive. A number of them couldn't even swim. There was a Thai Navy diver that was trying to set up the system of getting them out, died when he ran out of air. And the approach of the monsoon season made it very clear that time was running out if they were to get them out, period, or get them out alive. Each boy, and we have some diagrams here, was fitted with full-face scuba masks. They were strapped to stretchers and pulled through the caves one by one, beginning July 7th. This was 14 days, 2 weeks after they entered the cave. Now, after medical examinations and observations, they were released, but they didn't go their own ways after that. Kanjin, can you explain what the boys chose to do after that and why?
Sure. In Buddhism, this concept of appreciation, also it comes into the idea of compassion. For the people, obviously, and I think the way of thinking, as you're saying, this being a Buddhist country, is quite different than the West. People, the idea that their personal responsibility for causing both the death of the diver as well as the people who took their time and the trouble they caused other people, that's a very important concept in the Eastern culture. And so, therefore, we always have to think how to repay. Of course, they cannot bring him back to life. And also how to repay all of these people, and even the world, for the kind of fear and suffering almost that they caused. So the idea that they became monks is one of the practices that actually Buddhism thinks that your daily practice, whether you're Buddhist or not, is beneficial to the world. Because if you're healthy, if you're mindful, therefore that also makes my world happier, more peaceful. So therefore, through one's practice, they're able to show appreciation. So in the tradition, for many reasons in Buddhist countries, people will go to the temple and become monks for a day or for a week, or even submit themselves to some practice in the memory of the person or in the action of appreciation.
So I guess the other aspect of the story that fascinates me, and I think many people, is the question of why did this speak so powerfully to those of us that were half a world away, if not even more, at a time in which our society is, at least by some, described as being compassion challenged, when we tend to not see a connection between us and others. And Rick, I might ask you to respond to that first. Why did it grab us?
Well, I think first thing it was children. And we all can relate to children getting in a bad situation. The other thing is that they played soccer. You know, my kid played soccer, right? So again, that's a certain connection.
Awakened our sense of empathy. Maybe.
Awakened our sense of empathy, and, you know, they were suffering. There's no doubt about that, and our compassion as well.
Kenjin, anything?
So you just mentioned the word empathy, what the reaction. So the Buddhist word compassion comes from two Chinese characters, jihi. The first, if you look up compassion in the dictionary, it says empathy. But actually the Buddhist word, the first character is empathy. That means being able to feel the other person's similarity, being in another person's shoes. Second character actually means an action to relieve suffering. Performing some action, not just simply having empathy. Of course, children, we can relate to that. And that reminds me of a passage, a teaching from Master Tiantai in the Makashikan, which is an ancient book which basically is the base for most of Japanese and Chinese and Korean Buddhism. He says, as a practitioner, the Buddha, he says, therein all are my children. Now, does that mean that the Buddha looks at us like his children, as we hear sometimes in the Christian concept? I'm the father of children. Actually, what this means is that we should look at other people as our own flesh and blood, as our own children, because they believe that if children are sick, parents are sick. You feel the same thing. So that concept of empathy and compassion, I believe, is what other people were able to connect to because they were children. A lot of times with adults, people write off people going, well, you know, they lived a good life, that's the end of that, or they should have known better. Right? But actually, in that situation, they said, what if that was my child? Again, the soccer and all of the examples that you gave concerning that. But, you know, the interesting thing is, I think that hopefully, I wish there would have been more of a reaction in the sense that people asked some of the questions that you asked. Why is this happening? Why were they able to do it? Rather than just being a good story, as far as a happy ending. You know, if it had turned out differently, it would have just been an unfortunate event. But I hope that people are able to take it that this is an example, because it was in kind of an optimal example, a situation of hardship. And when you talked about the small passages, I'm claustrophobic. So in order to actually deal with that, how would you have, what kind of state of mind would you have, you know? And so therefore, and then also being able to simply survive without food, without warmth. And again, also the most difficult part is other people. So that's why this is a perfect example, I think, for, as you were saying, for the modern situation, the modern worries that we have, that there is a way to heal both our relationship with others as well as with ourselves. And it does nothing necessarily, I think, to do that we have to point towards philosophies or religion. There's a interpersonal relationship, an interpersonal action, and a personal behavior, personal responsibility, that what we do with our lives has an immediate effect, not only in our small situation, our small society, but actually this touched the entire world.
It did.
It can do that.
And the perspectives both of you shared, I hope we'll get this dialogue going with more people to see that there is a backstory, there is a deeper story. There was a popular phrase, the child is the father of the man, and I think these boys and the soccer coach served as powerful teachers, I think, for all of us that were well advised to take as examples.
And I'm sure for each other, because without other people, we cannot survive. So I think that even the coach's survival and ability to lead is partially due to the children as well. So we cannot just say one person was strong enough to lead, but actually I think they did it together. And actually, as you said, there was even a child of a different faith, of a Muslim faith. That says something very important. Because again, this is showing the humanity of the world. And I think that's a very important part that actually they don't say too much about, because the general amount were Buddhists. However, they were all able to interrelate that information, however they did it, in their own tradition, their own understanding, and their own beliefs. And therefore, the result is this. I think that's a microcosm of what we can bring to the world.
We're going to have to leave with that lesson because the clock has run to the end, but thank you both so very much. And thank you for joining us, and we hope that you'll join us on our next edition of Challenge 2.0.